Hello there, my dreamy travelers. Tonight, we journey into the world of Vampire Diaries, where the line between life and death is thin as moonlight, and every heartbeat carries a secret. It begins in a quiet town draped in beauty and shadow, where two brothers are bound by love and eternity, and a girl's fate becomes the thread that ties their worlds together. Here, love is both a blessing and a curse. Time bends beneath desire, and the supernatural hides in plain sight, waiting to be awakened. So, close your eyes, breathe deep, and drift into a world where the moon remembers every love that refused to die. The year was 1864, and Mystic Falls, Virginia, existed as a jewel of the Confederate South, untouched by the war that raged across the nation. The town's founding families had built something precious here, something worth protecting at any cost. Grand estates dotted the countryside, their white columns gleaming in the southern sun, their manicured gardens speaking to wealth accumulated through generations of careful commerce. The Salvatore estate stood as one of the finest properties in the county. Giuseppe Salvatore had built his fortune through shipping and trade, had established himself as a pillar of the community, a man whose word carried weight in town councils and business dealings alike. He was a hard man, Giuseppe, shaped by the rigid expectations of his time, by the belief that strength meant the absence of softness, that authority demanded absolute obedience. He had two sons, and they could not have been more different. Stefan Salvatore was the younger, barely 17, with the kind of earnest goodness that seemed almost anachronistic even in that gentler age. He believed in honor, in doing right simply because it was right, in the fundamental decency of people, if only they were given the chance to show it. He read poetry when his father wasn't watching, spent time with the estate's workers learning their names and their stories, carried himself with a gentle courtesy that made even hardened cynics soften in his presence. His older brother Damon was 25, a veteran of the Confederate Army who had returned home changed by what he'd witnessed on distant battlefields. The war had carved something out of him, had replaced youthful idealism with a harder, more pragmatic worldview. He drank too much, smiled too easily at inappropriate moments, said the things others only thought, and carried himself with the careless confidence of someone who had already seen the worst humanity had to offer and survived it. Their father loved them in his way, which is to say he loved the versions of them he'd imagined they would become rather than who they actually were. Stefan was too soft, too compassionate, too willing to question the established order. Damon was too reckless, too prone to mockery, too resistant to Giuseppe's authority. Neither son quite met the exacting standards of a man who believed children existed primarily to carry forward family legacy and social position. The brothers loved each other with the complicated intensity that comes from being both allies and competitors, from sharing blood and history while pursuing fundamentally different approaches to life. Stefan looked up to Damon with a younger sibling's admiration tinged with concern for his brother's self-destructive tendencies. Damon protected Stefan with fierce loyalty, while simultaneously resenting the ease with which his younger brother moved through the world, the way goodness seemed to come naturally to Stefan, while Damon had to work at merely appearing decent. Then Catherine Pierce arrived in Mystic Falls, and everything changed. She appeared in the spring of 1864, a vision of European sophistication in a provincial southern town. She claimed to be an orphan from Atlanta, recently bereaved and seeking refuge with distant relatives. Her accent carried hints of places far more exotic than Georgia. Her manner spoke to education and refinement beyond what most local girls possessed, and her beauty was the kind that stopped conversations and turned heads in church. Catherine had dark curls that cascaded past her shoulders, eyes that seemed to hold secrets and promises in equal measure, a smile that could be innocent or knowing depending on who was receiving it. She moved through rooms like she owned them, spoke with confidence that bordered on impropriety for a young unmarried woman, and possessed an intensity of presence that made everyone else seem slightly faded by comparison. She set her sights on the Salvatore brothers almost immediately. Stefan was invited to escort her to church socials, where she would laugh at his earnest observations and touch his arm with casual intimacy that made his heart race. Damon she engaged in verbal sparring, matching his cynicism with her own, creating a crackling tension that everyone around them could feel but couldn't quite name. The brothers fell in love with her, both of them, completely and without reservation. Stefan loved her with the pure devotion of first love, seeing in her a kindred spirit who appreciated beauty and art, who read the same poetry, who seemed to understand the parts of himself his father dismissed as weakness. He believed she brought out the best in him, made him want to be worthy of her affection. Damon loved her with the consuming passion of someone who had thought himself incapable of such feeling, who had survived war and loss by cultivating emotional distance. Catherine broke through his defenses effortlessly, made him feel alive in ways the battlefield never had, offered him something worth living for beyond mere survival. Catherine encouraged both brothers. She accepted Stefan's courtship publicly, allowing him to escort her to social events, to bring her flowers, to sit in the parlor under watchful eyes. But privately, she met with Damon in the gardens after dark, in shadowed corners of the estate, in stolen moments that felt electric with possibility and transgression. The brothers began to fracture under the strain of this triangle. Stefan, who had never before competed with his brother for anything, felt betrayed by Damon's pursuit of the woman he loved. Damon, who had spent his life coming second to his younger brother in their father's affections, refused to step aside now that he'd finally found something he wanted more than Giuseppe's approval. What neither brother knew was that Catherine Pierce was not what she claimed to be. She was not an orphan from Atlanta. She was not even human. Catherine Pierce was a vampire, over 400 years old, born Katerina Petrova in Bulgaria in 1473. She had been turned while fleeing from Klaus Mikkelsen, one of the original vampires who wanted to use her as a sacrifice in a ritual. She had survived by becoming the thing she'd feared, had spent centuries running and hiding and reinventing herself, always staying one step ahead of the danger that pursued her. She had come to Mystic Falls because it was small and isolated, because its founding families had their own secrets that might provide cover for hers, because she could disappear into the fabric of a provincial town in ways that were impossible in larger cities. And she had chosen the Salvatore brothers because she could, because their devotion amused her, because having two handsome young men competing for her affection helped pass the eternal boredom of immortality. Catherine fed on both brothers. She would visit their rooms after the household had settled into sleep, would appear like a dream or a fever vision, beautiful and impossible in the candlelight. She would bite their wrists or their necks, drinking just enough to sustain herself without killing them, using her vampire abilities to cloud their memories so they would wake believing they'd had particularly vivid dreams. She also compelled them, used her vampire powers to manipulate their emotions, to intensify their feelings for her, to ensure their absolute devotion. The brothers loved her genuinely, but that love was amplified and twisted by Catherine's interference, turned into an obsession neither could control or understand. But Mystic Falls had its own secrets, its own supernatural awareness. The founding families, the Salvatores, the Lockwoods, the Fells, the Forbesies, the Gilberts, had known about vampires for generations. They had formed a secret council dedicated to identifying and eliminating the vampire threat, to protecting their town from the monsters that had occasionally emerged from the wilderness to prey on unsuspecting citizens. Giuseppe Salvatore was part of this council. When rumors began to circulate about vampires in town, about mysterious deaths and strange behavior, Giuseppe became convinced that the threat was real and immediate. He began investigating, using his position and resources to identify potential vampires among Mystic Falls residents. Catherine realized the danger too late. By the time she understood that the founding families were organizing a roundup, that they planned to capture and kill all suspected vampires, she had only hours to act. She tried to compel her way out, but there were too many people involved, too many precautions taken. The vervain plant, toxic to vampires and preventing compulsion, had been distributed among the founding families and worn in sachets around their necks. The roundup happened at Fell's Church, a coordinated action by the founding families to capture all suspected vampires simultaneously. Catherine was taken along with 26 others, locked in a building that would be set ablaze, destroyed along with any evidence of the supernatural that might bring unwanted attention to Mystic Falls. Stefan and Damon learned of Catherine's capture and immediately confronted their father. Giuseppe revealed the truth, that Catherine was a vampire, a monster, a demon who had been feeding on his sons and manipulating them with supernatural powers. He showed them the evidence, the testimonies, the undeniable proof of what she was. The brothers didn't care. In that moment, learning that the woman they loved was a vampire, that she had been drinking their blood and clouding their memories, they found they loved her still. Perhaps even more, because now her impossibility made sense. Her otherness had an explanation. She was supernatural, yes, but she was theirs. They begged Giuseppe to spare her, offered anything. their inheritance, their names, their futures. They would leave Mystic Falls, would take Catherine far away, would ensure she never harmed anyone in town. Just spare her life. Giuseppe refused. His sons had been corrupted, he believed, twisted by vampire compulsion into defending a monster. The only solution was to eliminate the threat and hope that distance and time would restore his sons to their senses. Stefan and Damon went to the church anyway, determined to rescue Catherine from the building where the vampires were imprisoned. They fought through the guards, took bullets and knife wounds in their desperate attempt to reach her. But they were too late. The building was already burning, and the guards overpowered them before they could enter the flames. Catherine appeared to them in the chaos, her voice in their minds through some vampire power, telling them she loved them both, that she had given them a gift, that they would be together again. Neither brother understood what she meant. They could only watch as the church burned, as their father's men ensured no vampire escaped the flames. Giuseppe took his wounded sons home and locked them in their rooms to recover. He believed he was saving them, protecting them from their own corrupted judgment. He told them Catherine had died in the fire, that the vampire threat had been eliminated, that life would return to normal now that the monsters were destroyed. But Catherine had indeed given them a gift, though whether it was truly a gift remained debatable. In the nights before her capture, she had been feeding Stefan and Damon her blood, not enough that they noticed, just small amounts mixed with the blood she took from them. Vampire blood in a human system had a particular property. If that human died with vampire blood in their body, they would wake in transition, caught between death and vampirism, with the choice to complete the transformation by feeding on human blood, or refusing and dying permanently. Stefan and Damon died that night. Giuseppe, believing his sons remained under Catherine's supernatural influence, made a choice that would haunt multiple timelines. He shot them both, his own sons, believing he was saving their souls by ending their corrupted lives before the vampire blood could take hold. He was wrong about the timing. The blood was already there, already working its dark magic. Stefan woke first, gasping and disoriented in the dark of his room. His chest bore the wound where his father's bullet had pierced his heart, but the hole was closing before his eyes, flesh knitting together with impossible speed. His senses were overwhelmed, every sound too loud, every scent too strong, the candlelight bright as noon sun in his darkened room. Damon woke minutes later with similar confusion and the same horrifying realization. They were dead. But they were also alive, caught in some terrible liminal space between mortality and something else entirely. Giuseppe found them like that, standing in Stefan's room, looking at their reflections in the mirror, seeing themselves, but somehow other. The old man understood immediately what had happened, what Catherine had done. His sons were in transition. They would become vampires unless they died permanently before completing the transformation. Giuseppe made his final choice. He came at his sons with a stake, determined to end this abomination, to kill them properly before they could become monsters. The brothers fought back on instinct, and in the struggle, Giuseppe fell on his own weapon. He died in front of his sons, his blood pooling on the floor, his final expression one of horror and betrayal. Stefan and Damon stood over their father's corpse and faced their impossible choice. They could refuse to feed, could let themselves die permanently. could end this nightmare before it truly began, or they could complete the transition, could drink human blood and become the monsters their father had devoted his life to destroying. Stefan chose death, or he tried to. He was ready to let himself fade, to die as a human, even if he'd briefly walked in this strange transitional state. But Damon couldn't bear to lose his brother, couldn't face eternity alone, couldn't let Stefan make the noble sacrifice without him. Damon fed, found someone in town, used his new supernatural speed and strength, drank deep, and completed his transformation. Then he came for Stefan, brought him a victim, forced the blood down his brother's throat despite Stefan's protests and struggles. If Damon was damned, Stefan would be damned alongside him. They would walk this dark road together, or not at all. Stefan completed his transition hating his brother for the choice Damon had taken from him. They buried Giuseppe quietly, told the town their father had died of a heart condition, maintained the fiction for a few final weeks. But Stefan couldn't stay in Mystic Falls, couldn't remain in the place where everything had been destroyed, where Catherine had burned and their father had died and they had become monsters. The brothers left separately. Stefan went north, seeking isolation, trying to learn control, attempting to be a vampire without being a monster. Damon went south, embracing what he'd become, drinking freely, killing without remorse, finding dark joy in the power and freedom vampirism offered. They would reunite and separate dozens of times over the next century and 45 years. Sometimes allies, sometimes enemies, always brothers, always bound by Catherine Pierce and that terrible night in 1864. The woman they'd both loved had destroyed them in trying to save them, had given them immortality when all they'd wanted was her. And through it all, neither brother knew the truth, that Catherine had never died in that fire, that she had escaped and was alive somewhere in the world, that the love and devotion that had turned them into vampires had been built partially on a foundation of lies and manipulation that would echo across centuries. The Salvatore brothers were no longer human. They were no longer the sons Giuseppe had raised. They were something new and terrible and eternal, frozen at 25 and 17 for however long their immortality would last. And their story, their tragedy, their impossible love and bitter hatred had only just begun. 145 years passed. The world changed around the Salvatore brothers while they remained frozen in their eternal youth, watching civilizations rise and fall, technologies evolve, wars reshaped nations. They lived through the Industrial Revolution, through 2 world wars, through the birth of the modern age. They moved from place to place, never staying long enough to draw attention, never aging while everyone around them grew old and died. Stefan had spent those decades trying to be something other than a monster. He fed on animals exclusively, lived quietly on the edges of human society, punished himself for what he'd become by denying himself the full power and pleasure of human blood. He had fallen off the wagon occasionally, had given in to his darker nature during periods he would later think of as his Ripper years, when the blood called too strongly and his control shattered completely. But always he returned to the struggle, to the attempt at being a vampire with a conscience. Damon had spent those same decades embracing his nature, drinking from humans, killing when it suited him, using compulsion to cover his tracks. He had searched for Catherine obsessively during the early years, convinced she had survived the fire at Fell's Church, certain that she was out there somewhere waiting for him. He had tortured himself with hope and with the growing suspicion that she had never loved him at all, that everything between them had been manipulation and lies. The brothers crossed paths occasionally, their reunions marked by conflict as often as camaraderie. They could never quite escape each other, could never quite forgive each other for that night in 1864 when everything had been destroyed. Stefan couldn't forgive Damon for forcing him to complete his transition. Damon couldn't forgive Stefan for his self-righteousness, for his belief that denying his nature made him superior to his brother. In 2009, Stefan Salvatore made a decision that would change everything. He decided to return to Mystic Falls. He told himself he was drawn by curiosity, by a desire to see how the town had changed in a century and a half. The truth was more complicated. Stefan had seen a girl, had glimpsed her photograph in a newspaper article about a car accident that had killed a local couple. The girl in that photograph looked exactly like Catherine Pierce. Same face, same hair, same delicate features. The resemblance was impossible, supernatural, and Stefan needed to understand what it meant. He enrolled at Mystic Falls High School, using compulsion and forged documents to create a believable identity. Stefan Salvatore, 17 years old, recently moved to town with his uncle. He rented the old Salvatore boarding house, the property that had once belonged to his family, that still technically belonged to him through layers of carefully constructed trusts and shell companies. And he prepared himself to encounter the girl who looked like the woman who had destroyed his life. Elena Gilbert was 17 years old and drowning in grief. 4 months earlier, her parents had died in a car accident on Wickery Bridge. The car had gone off the bridge into the water below, and her father Grayson had saved Elena first, had pulled her from the sinking vehicle and gotten her to the surface before going back for his wife Miranda. But he hadn't made it back up. Both of Elena's parents had drowned while she survived, and the guilt of that survival consumed her. She lived now with her younger brother Jeremy and her Aunt Jenna, trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy while everything inside her felt shattered. She was a good student, popular without being cruel about it, involved in school activities because that was what was expected of her. She had a best friend named Bonnie Bennett, who had been her constant companion since childhood, and another close friend named Caroline Forbes, whose relentless cheerfulness sometimes grated, but was also comforting in its consistency. Elena had recently broken up with her boyfriend, Matt Donovan, the boy she'd dated since freshman year, the steady, reliable presence who deserved better than a girlfriend who was emotionally absent and haunted by survivor's guilt. Matt was a good person, earnest and hardworking, and Elena had hurt him by ending their relationship. But she couldn't pretend anymore, couldn't maintain the facade of being okay when she felt like she was drowning just as surely as her parents had. Stefan saw her on his first day at Mystic Falls High School, and the shock of it nearly broke his careful control. She looked exactly like Catherine, not similar, not reminiscent, but identical in every way that mattered. The same face that had haunted his dreams for a century and a half. The same features that had driven him and his brother to damnation staring at him from across the parking lot with brown eyes that held none of Catherine's calculated seduction, but instead a deep sadness that called to something in Stefan's own broken soul. He tried to stay away from her, told himself that whatever Elena Gilbert was, doppelganger, descendant, cosmic coincidence, she represented danger and complications he didn't need. He should observe from a distance, should determine whether her resemblance to Catherine held any supernatural significance, and then leave Mystic Falls before he became entangled in another human life. But staying away proved impossible. They were assigned to be lab partners in biology class, and Elena looked at him with curiosity rather than fear, asked him questions about where he'd moved from and why he'd chosen Mystic Falls. She wrote in journals constantly, filling spiral notebooks with her thoughts and feelings, trying to process her grief through words in a way that reminded Stefan painfully of his own human habit of keeping a diary. Stefan found himself drawn to her despite every intention to maintain distance. She wasn't Catherine, he realized, wasn't manipulative or cruel or playing games with people's hearts. She was genuine, kind despite her pain, trying to be there for everyone around her, even while struggling with her own loss. She volunteered at the hospital, looked after her younger brother, worried about her aunt taking on the responsibility of 2 teenagers when Jenna had barely been an adult herself. They began spending time together. Stefan would walk Elena to class, would sit with her at lunch where her friends regarded him with varying degrees of curiosity and suspicion. Bonnie Bennett seemed immediately wary of him in ways she couldn't articulate, some instinct warning her that Stefan wasn't what he appeared to be. Caroline Forbes was openly interested, flirting with Stefan despite Elena's obvious connection to him, seeing him as a challenge to be conquered. Elena felt it too, the pull between them, the sense that Stefan understood her grief in ways others couldn't. She didn't know that he'd spent a century and a half mourning his own losses, that he recognized her pain because he carried similar wounds. She only knew that when she was with Stefan, the crushing weight of her parents' deaths felt slightly more bearable, that his presence offered a peace she couldn't find anywhere else. Stefan fought against falling in love with her, reminded himself daily that she was human and he was a monster, that being close to her put her in danger, that this connection could only end in tragedy. But Elena's sadness called to his own. Her genuine nature contrasted so sharply with Catherine's manipulations, and Stefan found himself wanting to protect her, to ease her pain, to be someone who brought light into her life rather than darkness. Then Damon came to town. Stefan felt his brother's presence before he saw him, that particular awareness vampires had of each other, the way they could sense their own kind nearby. Damon appeared at the Salvatore boarding house one evening, letting himself in without invitation, smiling that dangerous smile that meant trouble. Damon had aged not at all in the century and 45 years since they'd last seen each other. Still looked 25, still carried himself with that careless confidence, still radiated danger beneath the charming exterior. But something had hardened in him over the decades. Some last vestige of humanity had been worn away by time and disappointment, and the crushing realization that Catherine Pierce was never coming back for him. He had come to Mystic Falls for one reason. He believed Catherine was trapped in the tomb beneath Fell's Church. that she had been sealed there along with the other vampires during the 1864 roundup. He had spent decades searching for a way to open the tomb, and he believed Stefan's return to Mystic Falls meant his brother had finally found that solution. Stefan told him the truth, that Catherine had never been in the tomb, that she had escaped and faked her death, that she had never loved either of them enough to stay. He showed Damon the evidence he'd discovered over the years, the sightings of Catherine in other cities decades after she was supposed to have burned, the proof that she had played them both and left them to their fates. Damon refused to believe it, called Stefan a liar, accused him of trying to keep Catherine for himself, insisted that she was in that tomb and had been waiting a century and a half for rescue. His entire existence had been built around the belief that Catherine loved him, that she had been taken from him against her will, that reuniting with her would give meaning to his immortality. Without that belief, Damon had nothing but endless, empty years and a list of sins that could never be forgiven. The brothers fell into their familiar pattern of conflict. Damon stayed in Mystic Falls specifically to torment Stefan, to interfere with his attempts at living quietly, to remind him at every opportunity that they were monsters pretending to be human. He met Elena and was immediately fascinated by her resemblance to Catherine, saw her as either a sign that Catherine was near or as a cruel cosmic joke designed to torment both brothers. Damon played the villain because it was easier than acknowledging the pain beneath his actions. He killed casually, fed on humans without remorse, used compulsion to make people forget or to bend them to his will. He antagonized Stefan's attempts to build a life in Mystic Falls, made it clear he intended to open that tomb regardless of the consequences. But Elena saw something else in Damon. Beneath the cruelty and the violence, she recognized the same kind of pain she carried, the grief of losing someone and never quite recovering from that loss. She didn't excuse his actions, but she understood that Damon was broken in ways that mirrored her own brokenness. The supernatural world began to reveal itself gradually to Elena and her friends. Bonnie Bennett discovered she was a witch, that her family line carried magic passed down through generations. Her grandmother, Sheila Bennett, was a powerful witch who had served as keeper of supernatural secrets, who knew about vampires and werewolves and the other creatures that walked hidden among humans. Bonnie's magic manifested in small ways at first. Candles lighting without matches, intuitions that proved accurate, a sensitivity to the supernatural that made her immediately wary of both Salvatore brothers. Carolyn Forbes was attacked by Damon, who fed on her repeatedly and used compulsion to make her his personal blood bag. Stefan discovered what his brother was doing and was horrified, but Damon saw no problem with it. Caroline was human, therefore she was food, and using her didn't require guilt or remorse. Stefan forced Damon to stop, to compel Caroline to forget, but the damage was done and the incident drove another wedge between the brothers. Elena learned the truth about Stefan on a night when everything came crashing down around her carefully maintained denial. She saw his face change when he was feeding on an animal in the woods, saw the veins that appeared beneath his eyes and the fangs that descended, saw him as the predator he truly was. She ran. Of course she ran. Every survival instinct she possessed told her to flee from the monster in the woods. But Stefan caught up to her easily, his vampire speed making escape impossible. and he did something Catherine would never have done. He told her the truth. He explained what he was, how he'd been turned in 1864, how he'd spent a century and 45 years trying to be something other than a killer. He told her about Catherine, about the resemblance that had drawn him back to Mystic Falls, about the supernatural significance of Elena's face appearing on two different women separated by centuries. He confessed his feelings for her, admitted that loving her was selfish and dangerous, but that he couldn't seem to stop himself. Elena listened to all of it, processed the impossible reality of vampires and doppelgangers and ancient curses. She should have been terrified, should have called the police, or run screaming, or done any of a dozen rational things. Instead, she asked Stefan if he'd ever hurt anyone since returning to Mystic Falls. When he said no, when he explained his animal blood diet and his commitment to not harming humans, she made a choice that would define everything that followed. She chose to stay. Chose to trust him despite what he was. Chose to believe that Stefan Salvatore, the person, mattered more than Stefan Salvatore, the vampire. She saw his struggle, his genuine attempt to be good despite his nature, and she decided that was worth something, that he was worth something. Their relationship deepened after that revelation. Elena began researching vampires, learning about their strengths and weaknesses, understanding the world Stefan inhabited. She learned about vervain, the plant that could protect her from compulsion, and she began wearing it in a necklace Stefan gave her. But Damon remained determined to open the tomb beneath Fell's church, certain that Catherine was trapped inside, desperate to prove Stefan wrong about her abandonment. He allied himself with people who believed they had family members sealed inside during the 1864 roundup. The plan came together over weeks of preparation. Bonnie's grandmother Sheila had the power to break the spell sealing the tomb, but doing so would require immense magical energy and came with significant risks. Damon didn't care about the risks. He would sacrifice anything and anyone to reach Catherine, to prove that she had loved him, to reclaim the one thing that had given his immortality meaning. The tomb was opened in a ritual that nearly killed Sheila Bennett, that left Bonnie devastated and furious with the vampires who had used her grandmother's power. The vampires inside were released, starving, ancient creatures who had spent a century and 45 years sealed in darkness, preserved in desiccation, but aware, suffering in ways that had driven most of them mad, and Catherine Pierce was not among them. Stefan had been right. She had never been in the tomb, had escaped during the chaos of the roundup, had let everyone believe she was dead while she disappeared into the world to live her immortal life free from the Salvatore brothers' devotion. Damon's devastation was complete. His entire existence had been built around the hope of reuniting with Catherine, and that hope crumbled to nothing in the empty tomb. He had killed for her, had become a monster for her, had spent a century and 45 years believing she loved him enough to wait for rescue. And she had never cared enough to stay, had used him and Stefan and discarded them like toys she'd grown bored with. Elena found herself caught between the brothers, seeing the good in Stefan and the pain in Damon, trying to navigate a supernatural world she barely understood while still dealing with her own grief over her parents' deaths. She had become the center of something ancient and dangerous, though she didn't yet understand the full scope of what her doppelganger status meant, what role she was destined to play in events that had been set in motion centuries before her birth. Mystic Falls had awakened. The supernatural that had been hidden for generations was emerging into the light, and Elena Gilbert stood at the center of it all. A human girl who looked like a vampire from the 1800s, who had captured the attention of two immortal brothers who represented either salvation or destruction, depending on who was telling the story. And somewhere out in the world, Catherine Pierce watched and waited and planned, knowing that eventually the past she'd created would come calling, that the brothers she'd destroyed would have to face her again, that the girl wearing her face would learn exactly what it meant to be a Petrova doppelganger. Catherine Pierce returned to Mystic Falls like a ghost made flesh, appearing one autumn evening at the Salvatore boarding house with that same calculating smile she'd worn in 1864. She looked exactly as she had the night of the fire at Fell's Church, eternally young, devastatingly beautiful, carrying centuries of manipulation and survival in her dark eyes. Her appearance shattered what little peace Stefan and Damon had managed to build, reminded them viscerally of the woman who had destroyed their humanity and then abandoned them to their immortal fates. She had come back for a reason. Catherine Pierce never did anything without calculating the advantages first, without ensuring her survival took precedence over every other consideration. And now, after centuries of running, she needed the Salvatore brothers, needed their protection, their strength, their willingness to die for her, even after everything she'd done to them. Because something was hunting her, someone far more dangerous than the founding families who had tried to burn her in 1864, more powerful than any enemy she'd accumulated in 5 centuries of vampiric existence. His name was Klaus Mikkelsen, and he was the original hybrid, part vampire, part werewolf, and entirely unstoppable when he set his mind to claiming something he wanted. Klaus had been searching for Catherine for 500 years, not because he loved her, but because she had escaped him, had thwarted his plans, had stolen something he needed for a ritual that would break a curse binding his werewolf nature. Catherine had been meant as a sacrifice, her blood the final component in a spell that would unlock Klaus's true hybrid potential. Instead, she had turned herself into a vampire to avoid that fate, had made herself useless for the ritual, and had spent 5 centuries staying one step ahead of Klaus's rage. But Klaus had discovered something that changed everything. The doppelganger line hadn't ended with Catherine's transformation. The Petrova bloodline continued, and another doppelganger had been born. Elena Gilbert, with her identical face and her human blood, could serve as the sacrifice Catherine had avoided. And Klaus was coming to Mystic Falls to claim her. The story of Klaus Mikkelsen and his family, the originals, stretched back over 1,000 years. They had been human once, a family living in what would eventually become Mystic Falls, in a time when the land was wilderness, and the only inhabitants were the Native American tribes who understood the supernatural forces that moved through the forests. The Mikkelsen family had fled from Europe after their village was decimated by werewolves, seeking safety in the New World, believing they could escape the curse that had destroyed their home. But the werewolves followed them, or perhaps the werewolves had always been here, woven into the fabric of this land in ways the Mikkelsens hadn't anticipated. Klaus's younger brother Henrik was killed by werewolves during a full moon, torn apart while sneaking out to watch the transformation, dying in his older brother's arms while Klaus raged at his own helplessness. Their mother Esther, a powerful witch who had spent years studying magic in the old country, made a desperate choice. She would make her family immortal, would create beings strong enough that no werewolf could ever harm them again. She performed a spell that had never been attempted before, that drew on dark magic and blood sacrifice and the power of the full moon itself. She transformed her husband Mikael and her children, Finn, Elijah, Klaus, Cole, and Rebecca, into the first vampires, the original vampires from whom all other vampire bloodlines would eventually descend. Every vampire in existence could trace their lineage back to one of the Mikkelsen siblings, connected through blood and turning, and the complicated network of sires and progeny that spread across centuries. The spell had unintended consequences. The Mikkelsens became faster than any human, stronger than any natural predator, nearly indestructible save for a few very specific weaknesses. They could compel other vampires, not just humans, could override free will with a word and a glance. They could not be killed by conventional means. Stakes and decapitation that would destroy a normal vampire only wounded an original temporarily. But they also developed an insatiable thirst for blood that was more intense than anything their vampire descendants would experience. An aversion to sunlight that required magical jewelry to overcome, and a vulnerability to white oak wood from the tree that had been used in Esther's original spell. Klaus discovered another consequence years later. He was not Mikael's biological son, but the product of an affair Esther had with a werewolf from a neighboring pack, a liaison born of loneliness and desire, and the complicated politics of survival in hostile territory. When Klaus made his first kill as a vampire and triggered the werewolf curse that had been dormant in his blood, his hybrid nature manifested violently and without warning. He became stronger than his siblings overnight, more violent, capable of abilities no pure vampire possessed. His eyes would glow gold during moments of rage. His strength would increase during the full moon, and he could hurt his siblings in ways they couldn't hurt him. But Esther, horrified by what her son had become, placed a curse on Klaus that bound his werewolf side. She performed the spell in secret, with the help of a doppelganger named Tatya, whose blood held particular magical properties. Klaus retained his vampire abilities, but couldn't access his werewolf nature, couldn't transform under the full moon, couldn't create a pack, couldn't be the true hybrid he was meant to be. The curse locked away half of what he was, and Klaus spent the next 1,000 years feeling incomplete, feeling like something essential had been stolen from him. The curse could only be broken through a specific ritual, one requiring multiple components gathered with precision. The blood of a Petrova doppelganger, because Tatya's blood had been used to create the curse. The death of a werewolf during the full moon to honor the werewolf nature Klaus was trying to reclaim. The sacrifice of a vampire to balance the scales of life and death that governed supernatural magic. And the moonstone, a mystical talisman that had been used by witches for centuries to bind and unbind werewolf curses. Klaus had found his doppelganger in Bulgaria in 1473. Katerina Petrova, a young woman who had fled her family after bearing an illegitimate child out of wedlock, who had been disowned and cast out, and left to survive on her own resources. She had caught Klaus's attention through her resemblance to Tatia, through the way her face echoed the woman from 1,000 years earlier. The woman whose blood had been used in so many of Esther's spells. Klaus had been patient, had courted Katerina carefully, had positioned her exactly where he needed her for the ritual. He had planned everything carefully, had gathered all the necessary components, had been mere days away from breaking his curse and becoming the true hybrid he was always meant to be. But Katerina had discovered what he intended to do with her. She had overheard conversations she wasn't meant to hear, had pieced together the truth from fragments of information, and she had used her considerable survival instincts and her willingness to sacrifice others for her own preservation to escape her fate. She had stolen the moonstone Klaus needed for the ritual, had convinced a vampire named Trevor to help her escape Klaus's compound, and in a final act of desperate self-preservation, had forced another vampire named Rose to feed her vampire blood. Then Katerina had killed herself, had ended her human life deliberately, and when she woke in transition, she completed her transformation by feeding on human blood. She became Catherine Pierce, vampire, making herself useless for Klaus's ritual because the spell required a human doppelganger, not a vampire one. Klaus's rage at Catherine's escape had been apocalyptic. He had killed everyone connected to her, her entire family in Bulgaria, slaughtered in their homes, the vampires who had helped her, Trevor and Rose, hunted across continents. Anyone who might have known where she'd gone, eliminated with ruthless efficiency. He had spent the next 5 centuries searching for Catherine, determined to make her suffer for, thwarting his plans, to punish her for the audacity of choosing survival over his destiny. But more importantly, he had searched for information about the doppelganger line, for any indication that another Petrova descendant had been born who could serve in Catherine's place. The doppelgangers appeared every few generations, mystical copies created by the universe itself for reasons witches debated, but never fully understood. Klaus tracked the bloodline obsessively, followed every lead, investigated every rumor of a girl who looked like Katerina. Elena Gilbert represented everything Klaus had been searching for 5 centuries to find. She was human. She was the doppelganger. And she was vulnerable in ways Catherine had never been. Klaus began planning his return to Mystic Falls the moment he confirmed Elena's existence. Began gathering the other components he would need for the ritual. A vampire to sacrifice. Easy enough to find. He had 1,000 years of enemies and allies to choose from. A werewolf to kill during the full moon. More complicated, but werewolves still existed in scattered packs across the world. The moonstone that Catherine had stolen, currently in the possession of the Lockwood family, passed down through generations without the current holders understanding its true significance. Tyler Lockwood had recently triggered his own werewolf curse by accidentally killing someone in a car accident. The Lockwoods carried the werewolf gene in their bloodline, passed from parent to child, dormant until activated by taking a human life. Tyler's transformation had been agonizing and terrifying. His first full moon spent chained in the Lockwood cellar, while his bones broke and reformed, while his human consciousness submerged beneath animal instinct and rage. The McKelson family descended on Mystic Falls like a force of nature. First came Elijah, the noble brother who carried himself with old-world courtesy and honor, despite being a 1,000-year-old vampire. He wore expensive suits that spoke to centuries of accumulated wealth, moved with a grace that made even other vampires seem clumsy by comparison, and spoke with the measured precision of someone who had negotiated treaties and broken kingdoms. Elijah appeared at the Salvatore boarding house offering a deal. If Elena would agree to the sacrifice willingly, if she would allow Klaus to perform the ritual that would end her life, Elijah would ensure her friends and family remained safe from Klaus's wrath afterward. He spoke of his brother's vindictiveness with the weary knowledge of someone who had witnessed Klaus's rage for a millennium. He described the trail of destruction Klaus left behind when people opposed him, the innocent lives lost when Klaus felt thwarted or insulted, the creative cruelties Klaus employed to punish those who dared to challenge his will. Elijah painted a picture of Elena's loved ones dying one by one if she chose to fight. Jeremy killed, Bonnie tortured, Caroline turned into a weapon against her own friends. He made it clear that Elena's death was inevitable, and the only question was how many others would die alongside her. Elena refused with the kind of quiet strength that had defined her since her parents' death. She had not survived that tragedy, had not fought through grief and guilt and discovered an entire supernatural world, only to offer herself up as a willing sacrifice to an ancient monster. She would find another way, would use the time before Klaus arrived to discover a loophole, to protect the people she loved without dying in the process. Her stubbornness frustrated Elijah, but also earned his respect. He had lived 1,000 years and seen countless humans face death, and few of them met their fate with Elena's courage. Stefan and Damon rallied around Elena with fierce protectiveness that temporarily set aside their rivalry. Their old conflicts over Catherine, over Elena's affections, over how to live as vampires, seemed less important in the face of this existential threat. Neither brother would allow Klaus to kill Elena. They began researching obsessively, diving into old texts and supernatural archives, seeking any information about the ritual, about ways to survive it, about weaknesses the originals might possess that could be exploited. Bonnie Bennett dove into her family's grimoires, ancient spellbooks passed down through generations of Bennett witches. Her ancestor Emily Bennett had been a powerful witch in 1864, had helped Catherine Pierce in exchange for protection of Emily's own descendants. Bonnie discovered references to a spell that might save Elena's life, a way to bring someone back from death if that death occurred as part of a supernatural ritual. It would require immense power, would need to be performed at the exact moment of death, would likely kill Bonnie in the process of casting. But it offered hope where there had been none. Elijah provided crucial information despite his initial alliance with Klaus. His relationship with his brother was complicated by 1,000 years of loyalty and betrayal, of love and resentment, of standing beside Klaus while also recognizing his brother's monstrosity. Elijah revealed the full scope of the curse on Klaus, explained that the hybrid nature his brother was trying to unlock would make him nearly invincible. Klaus as a vampire was dangerous enough, immortal, impossibly strong, capable of compulsion that could override another vampire's free will. Klaus as a fully realized hybrid would be unstoppable. He would be able to create more hybrids by turning werewolves with his blood, would build an army of supernatural creatures loyal only to him through sire bonds, would reshape the balance of power in the supernatural world entirely. The ritual had to happen on a full moon. Klaus arrived in Mystic Falls with days to spare, bringing with him a presence that made other vampires nervous and humans uneasy, without understanding why. He was handsome in a dangerous way, with an artist's sensitivity warring against a warrior's brutality. He painted and sketched, created beauty with the same hands that had killed thousands. He spoke with an accent that revealed his centuries of travel through Europe and beyond, carried himself with the confidence of someone who had never truly been defeated, who had survived a millennium through cunning and ruthlessness in equal measure. Klaus took Elena by force when attempts at negotiation and manipulation failed, used his superior strength and speed to capture her, brought her to the site he'd chosen for the ritual, the same quarry where Tyler Lockwood's werewolf curse had been triggered, where the veil between worlds grew thin under the full moon's influence. He had his vampire sacrifice already prepared in the cruelest way possible. Jenna Summers, Elena's aunt and guardian, whom Klaus had turned into a vampire specifically for this purpose. He had attacked Jenna, fed her his blood, and then killed her, forcing her to wake in transition. The cruelty of it was deliberate, forcing Elena to watch her aunt die twice, first as a human and then as a newborn vampire sacrificed in the ritual that would kill Elena herself. The werewolf component came from Tyler Lockwood, whom Klaus killed without ceremony or remorse. Tyler had tried to help Elena, had used his newly triggered werewolf abilities to fight Klaus, but he was no match for a 1,000-year-old original. Klaus snapped his neck casually, used his death as fuel for the spell, barely acknowledged the life he was ending. And finally, as the moon reached its apex and bathed the quarry in silver light, Klaus performed the ritual that had been denied him for 5 centuries. He drained Elena's blood into an ancient ceremonial bowl, spoke the words his mother Esther had written 1,000 years ago, words in a language so old that only the originals still remembered its cadences. He felt his curse break with agonizing intensity, felt the chains that had bound his werewolf nature shatter and fall away. The transformation was excruciating. Klaus's body convulsed as his werewolf nature surged to the surface for the first time in a millennium, as bones broke and reformed, as his vampire body tried to accommodate abilities it had never held before. His eyes glowed gold, then red, then settled into something between the two. When it was over, Klaus stood as the true hybrid he was always meant to be, vampire and werewolf combined, possessing the strengths of both species and the weaknesses of neither. He was faster than before, stronger than should have been possible, and for the first time in 1,000 years, he felt complete. Elena died as the ritual required. Her blood was drained, her heart stopped beating, and Stefan held her body while Damon raged at Klaus with impotent fury. But Bonnie and her witch allies had been working their own spell throughout the ritual, channeling the power of the full moon and the energy released by the ritual itself. They brought Elena back from death, pulled her soul from whatever liminal space it had traveled to, and restored her to life minutes after Klaus had killed her. John Gilbert, Elena's biological father, had one more role to play in saving his daughter. He had been preparing for this since learning of the prophecy, had known the risks, had accepted that saving Elena would cost him his own life. He wore a ring that allowed him to come back from death if killed by supernatural means, a ring that had protected him multiple times already. But he gave that ring to Elena in her final moments, slipped it onto her finger as Bonnie's spell took hold, and used an ancient piece of magic that transferred his life force to hers. John died so Elena could truly live, closed the loophole that might have left her vulnerable to Klaus's discovery that she'd survived. Klaus left Mystic Falls believing his ritual had been successful, believing Elena was dead and buried and his transformation complete. He began his work immediately, traveling to the Appalachian Mountains where werewolf packs still roamed in isolated territories. He attempted to create hybrid followers by feeding werewolves his blood and having them trigger their vampire transitions by killing humans. But something was wrong. The new hybrids died in agony instead of transforming, their bodies rejecting Klaus's blood, hemorrhaging from every orifice as both species warred within them. Klaus realized with growing rage that his ritual had been incomplete somehow, that something had gone wrong in ways he didn't yet understand. The truth would eventually come out, that Elena had survived, that the doppelganger's blood was still necessary for Klaus's hybrid creation to succeed, that her death and resurrection had broken some crucial component of the spell. Klaus's hybrids needed Elena's blood, living and freely given, to complete their transformations. But for now, Elena and her friends had bought time to heal from the trauma of the ritual, to mourn Jenna and John, to prepare for the inevitable moment when Klaus would discover the truth and return to claim what he believed was his. The Mikkelsen family established themselves in Mystic Falls despite the hostility they faced from every quarter. Rebecca, the sister who had spent 1,000 years loving and hating her brothers in equal measure, who carried her own scars from a millennium of Klaus's paranoia and control, and Klaus himself, the hybrid king who would reshape the supernatural world in his image, or destroy it trying, who had finally achieved his destiny only to discover it was incomplete, who needed Elena Gilbert alive when he had believed her death was the answer to everything. Elena had survived her prophesied death, but the cost had been devastating. Her Aunt Jenna was gone, killed and turned and killed again in the cruelest way possible. John Gilbert, the father she'd barely known and had only recently begun to understand, had sacrificed himself to save her. And she now carried the knowledge that her blood was valuable, that she would always be a target, that being the doppelganger meant her life would never truly be her own. The ancient bloodlines that had been set in motion 1,000 years ago continued to play out their patterns, continued to demand sacrifices and draw lines of loyalty and betrayal, and Elena Gilbert stood at the center of it all. The concept of the humanity switch existed as both salvation and curse for vampires who found the weight of immortality too heavy to bear. It was a psychological mechanism unique to their species, a way to turn off emotions, conscience, and empathy with the mental equivalent of flipping a switch. With humanity engaged, vampires felt everything: guilt over their kills, love for those they'd lost, horror at what they'd become. With humanity disengaged, they felt nothing except the thirst and the pleasure of feeding, becoming perfect predators, unconcerned with the moral implications of their actions. Stefan Salvatore had intimate knowledge of what happened when that switch flipped off. His history was stained with a period he referred to only as his Ripper days. A decades-long descent into darkness that had begun in the 1920s and had repeated in various forms throughout his long existence. When Stefan lost control, when the animal blood diet failed and human blood touched his lips, something fundamental broke inside him. He didn't just feed. He ripped into his victims with savage abandon, tore them apart, drained them so completely that his kills became recognizable by the sheer violence of the attack. The Ripper wasn't born of cruelty, but of addiction. Stefan's control was absolute or non-existent, with no middle ground between the two extremes. One taste of human blood and the floodgates opened, and Stefan became a monster who killed compulsively, who couldn't stop once he started, who left trails of bodies that drew attention from human authorities and supernatural enemies alike. He remembered every kill with perfect clarity even centuries later, carried the weight of those deaths like stones around his neck, punished himself through his animal blood diet as penance for sins that could never be forgiven. Klaus discovered Stefan's dark history and recognized it as leverage. The hybrid needed Stefan's cooperation for reasons that went beyond simple compulsion. He needed someone who understood control and lack thereof, someone whose blood could help create stable hybrids, someone whose expertise in managing bloodlust might unlock the secret of why Klaus's hybrid transformations kept failing. So Klaus did what Klaus did best. He identified a weakness and exploited it mercilessly. Klaus forced Stefan to turn off his humanity switch, used compulsion reinforced by his original power to reach into Stefan's mind and flip that mental switch, to shut down everything that made Stefan more than a predator. Then Klaus fed Stefan human blood, knowing exactly what would happen, knowing that the Ripper would emerge without humanity to restrain him. Klaus created a monster and claimed ownership of it, forced Stefan to serve as his companion in violence, to prove his loyalty through increasingly horrific kills. Stefan spent months as Klaus's enforcer, traveling with the hybrid as he searched for ways to create his hybrid army, killing on command, ripping through victims without conscience or remorse. He became the Ripper again, and this time there was no Stefan underneath trying to fight his way back to control. There was only the blood and the hunt and the savage satisfaction of feeding without restraint. Elena watched the man she loved disappear into darkness and felt helpless to stop it. She saw Stefan kill without hesitation, saw the emptiness in his eyes when he looked at her, saw that everything they'd shared meant nothing to the Ripper who wore Stefan's face. Klaus kept Stefan close specifically to torture Elena and Damon, to remind them that Stefan was his now, that the noble suffering vampire they'd known was gone and might never return. Damon stepped into the role Stefan had vacated, becoming Elena's primary protector in his brother's absence. It was a position Damon had always wanted and had never expected to achieve, and he approached it with complicated emotions. Satisfaction at finally being Elena's first choice, guilt that his brother's suffering had created the opportunity, and genuine determination to keep Elena safe from Klaus and every other threat that emerged from Mystic Falls' increasingly chaotic supernatural landscape. Elena and Damon's relationship deepened during Stefan's absence. They were drawn together by shared grief over losing Stefan, by the constant danger that required trust and cooperation, by a connection that had been building beneath the surface since Damon first arrived in Mystic Falls. Elena had always seen the good in Damon that he tried so hard to hide, had recognized that his cruelty was armor protecting deep vulnerability. Damon had loved Elena from the beginning, though he'd hidden it behind antagonism and inappropriate humor, had tried to deny what he felt because Stefan had claimed her first. Their growing closeness felt like betrayal, even as it felt inevitable. Stefan was still alive, still technically Elena's boyfriend, even if he currently existed as Klaus's emotionless puppet. But Elena needed someone to lean on, and Damon needed to be needed, and they fell into a relationship that was part alliance, part genuine affection, and part compensation for the absence they both felt. Caroline Forbes had her own journey through darkness and back to light. She had been turned into a vampire by Catherine Pierce in a scheme designed to torment the Salvatore brothers, killed in transition, and forced to complete her transformation without choosing it. Carolyn woke as a vampire, terrified and overwhelmed, her insecurities and self-doubt amplified by heightened vampire emotions, her control tenuous at best during those early days. But Carolyn proved stronger than anyone expected. She learned control through sheer force of will, refused to let vampirism define her, maintained her humanity more successfully than vampires centuries older. She became fiercely protective of her friends, used her organizational skills to manage supernatural crises, and evolved from the insecure girl who had tried too hard into a powerful woman who knew exactly who she was and what she stood for. Her relationship with Tyler Lockwood grounded her during the chaos. Tyler had triggered his werewolf curse and was struggling with his own identity crisis, trying to understand what being a werewolf meant for his future. Caroline and Tyler bonded over their shared experience of supernatural transformation, over the difficulty of maintaining humanity when their very nature pushed them toward the monstrous. They loved each other with the intensity of people who understood what the other was going through, who could offer support that came from genuine shared experience rather than sympathy. But Klaus complicated everything. He took an interest in Caroline that went beyond strategy or manipulation, genuinely drawn to her strength and her refusal to be intimidated by him. He showed her artwork he'd created, spoke to her about the loneliness of immortality, revealed vulnerabilities he showed to almost no one else. Caroline was horrified by her own attraction to him, by the fact that she could see humanity in a monster who had killed countless people, who had sacrificed Elena and shown no remorse. Tyler was sired to Klaus through the hybrid bond, compelled to obey Klaus's commands, unable to resist even when ordered to do things that went against his own moral code. The sire bond didn't affect emotions. Tyler's love for Caroline was genuine, but it controlled his actions completely. Klaus used this bond to torment Tyler, to force him to hurt Caroline, to demonstrate his absolute power over those he created. The struggle to bring Stefan back from the darkness consumed months. Elena refused to give up on him, insisted that the Stefan she loved was still inside somewhere, that his humanity could be restored if they could just break Klaus's compulsion and convince Stefan to flip his switch back on. Damon was more pragmatic, argued that the Stefan they knew might be gone permanently, that sometimes vampires who turned off their humanity chose to stay that way because feeling nothing was easier than feeling everything. The breakthrough came when Elena was kidnapped by a Ripper vampire who wanted Stefan as a companion in violence. Stefan was forced to choose: let Elena die, or care enough about her survival to feel something. In that moment, trapped between losing Elena and maintaining his emotionless existence. Stefan's humanity began to crack. He saved her, and the act of saving her reminded him why he'd turned his humanity off in the first place. Because caring hurt too much. Because every person he loved either died or suffered because of him. Stefan's return to humanity was agonizing. He felt the weight of every kill he'd committed during his months as Klaus's Ripper. Felt the guilt crash over him like a tsunami. Wanted desperately to turn his humanity back off because the pain was unbearable. Elena and Damon helped him through it, reminded him that he was more than his worst moments, that redemption was possible even after the darkest acts. But Stefan's relationship with Elena had been fundamentally changed by his absence. He could see what had developed between Elena and Damon during those months, could feel the connection they'd built while he was gone. Stefan wanted Elena to choose him, wanted to reclaim what they'd had before Klaus destroyed it. But he also understood that he couldn't erase the time he'd spent as a monster. Elena had watched him kill without conscience, had seen the Ripper in all its horror, and that couldn't be unseen or forgotten. The revelation of vampire sire lines added another layer of complexity to the supernatural politics of Mystic Falls. Every vampire could trace their lineage back to one of the original vampires. Klaus, Elijah, Rebecca, Call, or Finn. The connection went beyond simple family trees, though. If an original died, every vampire in their sire line died with them. Thousands of vampires scattered across the world could be eliminated by killing a single original, making the Mikkelsons both incredibly powerful and incredibly vulnerable. This knowledge changed the strategy around dealing with Klaus. Killing him would eliminate Tyler and every other hybrid he'd created, along with potentially thousands of vampires in his sire line. The moral implications were staggering. Was it acceptable to kill thousands to eliminate one monster? Did those vampire lives matter less because they'd been created by Klaus? Who had the right to make that decision? Stefan discovered he was in Klaus's sire line, that his entire existence was tied to the hybrid's survival. It explained things he'd never understood, why he'd never been able to truly defy Klaus, why the compulsion had worked so completely, why breaking free had been so difficult. He was connected to Klaus through blood and magic in ways that went beyond normal sire bonds, and that connection would exist for as long as both of them survived. The struggle with humanity switches and moral descents revealed a fundamental truth about the vampires in Mystic Falls. They were monsters trying to be people, predators attempting to maintain ethics that went against their very nature. Some succeeded more than others. Stefan punished himself through deprivation and guilt. Damon swung between embracing and resisting what he was. Caroline maintained her humanity through sheer determination and the support of friends who reminded her she was more than what she fed on. And Elena stood at the center of it all, human and vulnerable, watching the people she loved struggle with their monstrous natures while trying to maintain her own moral center in a world where the lines between right and wrong blurred constantly. She had seen Stefan at his worst, had fallen for Damon despite his darkness, had learned that loving vampires meant accepting that they would always be fighting against themselves, that the humanity they clung to was a choice they had to make every single day. The question that haunted everyone was simple and impossible. How long could they maintain their humanity in a world that constantly pushed them toward darkness? How many times could they flip the switch before it stopped working entirely? And what would they become when the struggle finally became too much to bear? Klaus had given them a glimpse of that future. A vampire who had lived 1,000 years with humanity engaged eventually became something that couldn't be categorized as simply good or evil. Klaus loved and killed with equal passion, created art and destroyed lives, protected his family while tormenting anyone outside that sacred circle. He was what happened when immortality stripped away the simple moral categories that governed human existence. When someone lived long enough that traditional ethics seemed like childish constructs. The Salvatore brothers looked at Klaus and saw their own possible futures. Stefan feared becoming so broken by guilt that he spent eternity punishing himself, turning his humanity off repeatedly until he forgot how to turn it back on. Damon feared becoming so numb to death that he killed without even the excuse of passion, becoming Klaus without Klaus's artistic sensibility or family loyalty. Elena looked at all of them and wondered how long she could love people who might eventually become monsters. She wondered if her love was enough to anchor them to their humanity, or if eventually even love would fail against the weight of immortality. She wondered what would happen when she grew old and died while they remained forever young, forever struggling, forever caught between the people they wanted to be and the predators they actually were. The humanity switch remained a constant temptation for vampires who found existence too painful. It offered oblivion from guilt, freedom from conscience, a vacation from the exhausting work of being good despite their nature. And every vampire in Mystic Falls knew that someday the temptation might become too strong to resist, that they might flip that switch and never find their way back to the light. The mystery of why Elena was a doppelganger, why her face had appeared across centuries on different women, led to discoveries that rewrote everything they understood about supernatural history. The Petrova doppelgangers weren't random cosmic accidents. They were shadows of the first Petrova, copies created by nature itself to maintain a balance that had been disrupted 2,000 years before Elena was born. The story began with Silas, the first true immortal, created millennia before the Mikkelsen family had even been conceived. He had been a powerful witch in ancient Greece, a member of a secret society called the Travelers, who practiced a particularly dark form of magic. Silas had fallen in love with a woman named Amara, a love so consuming that the thought of death separating them became unbearable. So Silas created the immortality spell, the very spell that would later be used by Esther Mikkelsen to create the original vampires. He and Amara drank the elixir that would make them truly immortal, unable to die by any means, unable to be killed, unable to age or sicken, or ever find peace in death. But nature demanded balance. True immortality violated the fundamental order of life and death, created an imbalance that nature could not tolerate. So nature created doppelgangers of Silas and Amara, shadow selves that could die in their place, that could restore the balance their immortality had disrupted. The Petrova line descended from Amara, each doppelganger a copy meant to fulfill the destiny the original had escaped. Silas's lover Ketsia, a witch more powerful than Silas himself, had been destroyed by his betrayal. She had helped him create the immortality spell, believing they would take it together, would spend eternity as lovers. Instead, Silas had chosen Amara, and Ketsia's heartbreak had curdled into vengeance. She created the cure to immortality, a single dose that could make an immortal being human again, vulnerable to death and time. But she didn't use it immediately. Instead, she fed it to Amara and then desiccated Silas while he was still immortal, entombed him on an island with the calcified cure just out of reach, condemned him to an eternity of stone prison while the woman he loved became human and eventually died. But Ketsia's revenge went deeper still. She created the other side, a supernatural purgatory where dead witches, vampires, werewolves, and other supernatural creatures would go instead of finding peace. It was a prison dimension anchored to the living world, where the dead remained aware and suffering, unable to move on, unable to find rest. Ketsia trapped Silas's spirit there so that even if he somehow escaped his physical prison, even if he found a way to die, he would never reunite with Amara in whatever afterlife awaited them. 2,000 years passed. Silas remained entombed, his consciousness trapped in stone, driven slowly mad by centuries of isolation and hunger, and the inability to die. The doppelgangers continued to appear, generation after generation, each one carrying the shadow of Amara without understanding what they represented. Tatia, who had lived during the time of the Mikkelsons. Katerina Petrova, who became Catherine Pierce. And finally, Elena Gilbert, the most recent iteration of a bloodline that stretched back 2 millennia. The cure to immortality became legendary among supernatural circles, whispered about in stories that most dismissed as myth. But Catherine Pierce had spent 5 centuries searching for it, desperate to become human again, to escape Klaus's vengeance by making herself useless to him. If she was human, she reasoned, Klaus might lose interest, might let her live the brief human lifespan she had left without hunting her. The search for the cure brought Elena and her friends to the island where Silas had been entombed. The island existed outside normal geography, hidden by magic, accessible only to those who knew the specific rituals required to breach its barriers. When they finally reached it, they found Silas's petrified body in a cave deep beneath the earth, calcified into stone, but still somehow aware, still conscious after 2,000 years of imprisonment. Bonnie Bennett felt drawn to the island in ways she couldn't explain, pulled by magic that predated any spell in her family's grimoires. She began experiencing visions of Ketsia, seeing through the ancient witch's eyes, understanding her pain and her rage. Ketsia had been dead for millennia, but her consciousness remained tethered to the other side, and she was using Bonnie as a conduit, speaking through her, trying to complete the revenge she'd begun 2,000 years earlier. Catherine Pierce had her own agenda. She found the cure before anyone else, driven by desperation and 500 years of survival instinct. But before she could take it herself, it was taken from her, and through a series of betrayals and supernatural manipulations, Catherine was forced to consume the cure against her will. She became human in an instant, her vampire nature stripped away. Her immortality ended after 5 centuries. She felt her heart beating too fast, felt exhaustion and hunger and vulnerability in ways she hadn't experienced since 1473. She was aging rapidly too, the 500 years she'd cheated catching up to her all at once, and she realized with growing horror that she had perhaps months to live instead of the decades she'd hoped for. Silas awakened. Someone fed him blood, breaking his desiccation. restoring his consciousness and his mobility after 2,000 years of stone prison. He emerged from his tomb with psychic powers that made even the originals seem weak by comparison. He could make people see whatever he wanted them to see, could infiltrate minds and create illusions so perfect that victims couldn't distinguish them from reality. He appeared to each person wearing a different face, often choosing the face of someone they trusted, manipulating them into serving his purposes without ever knowing they'd been deceived. To Stefan, Silas appeared wearing Stefan's own face. Because Silas was Stefan's doppelganger, the shadow self that nature had created to balance Silas's immortality, just as Elena was Amara's shadow. The resemblance was perfect, exact in every detail, and it created chaos as people couldn't tell which Stefan was real. Silas used this confusion to devastating effect, committed atrocities while wearing Stefan's face, destroyed Stefan's relationships and reputation, while Stefan was helpless to stop him. Silas had a goal beyond simple freedom. He wanted to die, wanted to find peace after 2,000 years of suffering, wanted to reunite with Amara in whatever afterlife awaited them. But true immortals couldn't die as long as the other side existed, as long as Ketsia's purgatory captured supernatural spirits. So Silas needed to destroy the other side itself, needed to collapse the barriers between life and death, needed to unleash every supernatural creature who had died in the past 2,000 years back into the living world. The price would be catastrophic. Destroying the other side would resurrect countless ancient vampires, powerful witches, and creatures that had been safely dead for centuries. It would eliminate the one place where supernatural beings found any kind of afterlife, leaving them nowhere to go when they died. But Silas didn't care about the consequences. He had suffered too long, wanted death too desperately, and he would sacrifice anything to achieve it. Stefan became Silas's primary victim. Silas locked Stefan in a safe and dropped him into a quarry, left him to drown over and over again throughout an entire summer. Vampires couldn't die from drowning, but they could suffer from it. And Stefan drowned repeatedly for months, feeling his lungs fill with water, feeling the panic of suffocation, dying and reviving in an endless loop of torture. When he was finally rescued, Stefan was shattered by post-traumatic stress, plagued by hallucinations of drowning even when he was on dry land, unable to trust his own perceptions of reality. Bonnie Bennett found herself at the center of an impossible choice. Ketsia offered her power, offered to teach her magic beyond anything the Bennett line had ever achieved, in exchange for helping destroy Silas. But the cost was becoming the anchor to the other side, replacing Amara, who had served that function for 2,000 years. The anchor felt every supernatural death, experienced the moment each spirit crossed from life to death, bore the weight of maintaining the barrier between worlds. It was agony stretched across eternity, but it was also power, and Bonnie believed she could use that power to protect the people she loved. She made the choice in secret, didn't tell anyone what becoming the anchor would cost her. She performed the spell that transferred the anchor status from Amara to herself, and in doing so, Bonnie died. Her physical body ceased functioning. Her spirit became trapped on the other side, and she existed as a ghost, visible only to certain people under specific circumstances. She watched her friends grieve for her, watched them suffer from her loss, and she couldn't tell them she was still there, still watching, still trying to help from beyond the veil. Amara was found alive, hidden in a mental institution, driven completely insane by 2,000 years of serving as the anchor. She had felt every supernatural death for millennia, had experienced countless murders and executions and transformations, had been unable to die herself despite the immortality cure making her human. The cure had simply been fed back to her repeatedly whenever she tried to kill herself, keeping her alive and suffering. When she was finally freed from being the anchor, she begged for death, pleaded with anyone who would listen to end her existence, and she found it at last after 2,000 years of waiting. The existence of the other side explained so much about the supernatural world. It was why vampires feared death despite their immortality, because death didn't offer peace, but rather an eternity of watching the living world without being able to interact with it. It was why ghosts occasionally manifested during supernatural events, because the veil between worlds grew thin, allowing the dead to briefly touch the living. It was why resurrection spells were possible, but came with terrible prices, because pulling someone back from the other side required unimaginable power and often cost other lives in exchange. Elena struggled with the revelations about her doppelganger status. She wasn't just Elena Gilbert, individual person with her own identity. She was a shadow of Amara, a copy created by mystical forces beyond her control. Her existence dictated by supernatural balance rather than chance or destiny. Every choice she'd made, every person she'd loved, felt tainted by the knowledge that she might be fulfilling patterns set in motion 2,000 years before her birth. Had Stefan fallen for her because he genuinely loved who she was, or because she wore Catherine's face? Was she even a real person, or just a magical construct designed to die in Amara's place? Stefan dealt with similar questions about his own identity. He was Silas's doppelganger, a shadow of the world's first immortal, connected through blood and magic to a being who predated vampire existence by millennia. The resemblance between them was perfect, exact, and it stripped away Stefan's sense of being unique or individual. He was a copy, a mystical placeholder, and everything he'd believed about himself felt like a lie. The confrontation with Silas ended in violence and sacrifice. Silas was finally killed by supernatural means, his immortality stripped away through magic and determination, his spirit released to find whatever peace awaited him. But his death destabilized the other side, began the process of its collapse, threatened to unleash 2,000 years of dead supernatural creatures back into the living world. The consequences of his actions would ripple through time, would create crises that took years to fully resolve. Catherine Pierce, dying rapidly from accelerated aging, became desperate in ways that made her more dangerous than she'd ever been as a vampire. She was dying, actually dying for the first time in 5 centuries, and she would do anything to survive. She began searching for ways to reverse the cure, to become a vampire again, to reclaim the immortality that had been stolen from her. Her desperation drove her to betrayals that would eventually position her as one of the greatest threats Elena and her friends would face. The other side remained unstable, kept functioning only through Bonnie's sacrifice and suffering. She bore the weight of every death, felt the passage of every supernatural spirit, existed in constant agony while pretending to her friends that everything was fine. She was the bridge between life and death, the anchor holding reality together, and she carried that burden because she loved her friends too much to let them know what it cost her. the revelation of Silas, of the doppelganger's true purpose, of the other side and its origins, rewrote the history they'd believed they understood. The supernatural world was older and more complicated than anyone had realized, built on foundations of love and betrayal and vengeance that stretched back millennia. And Elena Gilbert, descendant of Amara, shadow of the first Petrova, stood at the center of mysteries that had been unfolding for 2,000 years. Mysteries that would continue to shape her fate, whether she wanted them to or not. The Gemini Coven existed as one of the most powerful witch communities in North America, built on traditions that stretched back centuries and governed by rules that seemed designed to ensure survival at any cost. Their magic was different from the Bennett line or other witch families. Gemini witches were bound together through blood and ritual. Their power derived from connection to the coven rather than individual ability. But the coven's defining characteristic, the tradition that set them apart from every other magical family, was the merge. Every generation of the Gemini Coven produced a set of twins. On their 22nd birthday, those twins were required to merge, to perform a ritual that would combine their consciousness and magic into a single being. One twin would survive with both sets of powers, memories, and abilities. The other would die, their essence absorbed into the survivor, their individual existence ended. The merge ensured that the Coven's leadership passed to the strongest witch of each generation, but it also meant that every set of Gemini twins grew up knowing that one of them would eventually have to kill the other. Kai Parker was born a siphoner, a rare variation of witch who possessed no magic of their own, but could absorb magic from other sources. In the Gemini Coven, siphoners were considered abominations, failures of genetics, proof that something had gone wrong in the bloodline. Kai's parents viewed him with disgust and shame, treated him as less than his siblings, made it clear from childhood that he was unwanted and defective. Then Joshua Parker, the Coven leader, had another set of twins, Luke and Liv, born years after Kai, perfect in ways Kai could never be. They had magic, real magic that flowed through them naturally. They would merge on their 22nd birthday, and one of them would become the next leader of the Gemini Coven. Kai, the failed firstborn, would never lead, would never merge, would always be the mistake that preceded perfection. Something broke in Kai, watching his younger siblings receive the love and attention he'd been denied. On his 22nd birthday, the day he should have merged with a twin he'd never had, Kai murdered 4 of his younger siblings in a fit of rage and attempted to kill Luke and Liv as well. He stabbed them repeatedly, tried to siphon their magic to make himself powerful enough that the Coven would have to accept him. But Joshua stopped him before he could complete the slaughter, and the Coven performed a punishment that was supposed to last forever. They trapped Kai in a prison world, a pocket dimension that replicated May 10th, 1994, in perfect detail. The prison world was a snapshot of that single day, looping endlessly, with Kai as its only inhabitant. He existed alone in a world where time didn't pass, where the sun rose and set on the same day forever, where he could kill himself 1,000 times and wake up the next morning at dawn on May 10th, 1994. It was solitary confinement stretched into eternity, and the Gemini Coven believed it would contain Kai until the end of time itself. But prison worlds could be accessed from the outside under specific circumstances. When Bonnie Bennett was pulled into Kai's prison world along with Damon Salvatore, the dynamic changed completely. Kai had spent 18 years alone, had been driven partially insane by isolation, and suddenly he had company. He manipulated them with the skill of someone who had nothing but time to plan, convinced them he'd been wrongly imprisoned, positioned himself as victim rather than monster. Bonnie and Damon spent months trapped in 1994, reliving the same day over and over, trying to find a way home. They bonded during that time, grew close in ways that surprised them both. Damon had always been defined by his love for Elena, but with Elena absent and survival requiring cooperation, he found himself genuinely connecting with Bonnie. She saw past his performative cruelty to the person underneath, and he respected her strength and her refusal to give up hope even in an impossible situation. Kai revealed himself gradually, let his mask slip piece by piece until they understood what he truly was. A sociopath who felt nothing for others, who had murdered his siblings without remorse, who viewed people as tools to be used and discarded. He siphoned Bonnie's magic whenever he could, absorbed it and used it to increase his own power, and he smiled while doing it because he enjoyed her fear and helplessness. They escaped eventually, but Kai escaped with them. He returned to a world that had moved forward 18 years without him, found his younger siblings Luke and Liv terrified of the merge that was approaching, and he saw opportunity. The Coven had never designated which twin would merge with him. They'd assumed he would remain imprisoned forever. But now he was free, and he claimed his right to merge with one of his younger siblings, to absorb their magic and finally become the powerful witch he'd always believed he deserved to be. The merge between Kai and Luke happened during a confrontation that went wrong in every possible way. Luke forced the merge to happen early, sacrificed himself to prevent Kai from merging with Liv, chose to die so his sister could live. Kai absorbed Luke's magic and consciousness, gained power he'd never possessed as a pure siphoner, and something unexpected happened. Luke's goodness, his capacity for empathy and love, began to bleed into Kai's consciousness. The merge didn't just combine power, it combined personalities, and Kai found himself feeling emotions he'd never experienced before. Guilt and remorse that were entirely foreign to his sociopathic nature. But the change wasn't complete enough to redeem him. Kai still carried 18 years of rage and isolation, still remembered every moment of being called an abomination, still wanted revenge on the family that had imprisoned him. He attacked the Gemini Coven with supernatural violence, killed members who had known him since childhood, and prepared to murder his own father in a final act of patricide. The Coven linked Elena Gilbert's life to Bonnie's through a sleeping spell in a desperate attempt to protect Elena from supernatural threats. As long as Bonnie lived, Elena would sleep in a magical coma, preserved and protected, but absent from the world. When Bonnie died her natural human death decades in the future, Elena would wake unchanged, ready to live her life. Kai found this spell fascinating and terrible, saw it as the perfect revenge on Damon, who had abandoned him in the prison world. He didn't break the spell. That would have been too simple. Instead, he linked the spell to Bonnie's life in a way that made it unbreakable. Elena would sleep for 60 or 70 years, would miss her entire human life, and Damon would have to choose between desiccating alongside her or living without her. Lily Salvatore returned from death in the most unexpected way. Stefan and Damon's mother, who they'd believed died of consumption in 1858, had actually been turned into a vampire and trapped in the prison world where Kai had been imprisoned. Kai brought her back when he escaped, released her as a final manipulation, knowing that the Salvatore brothers would be destroyed by discovering their mother had been suffering alone for over a century. Lily was not the gentle mother they remembered from childhood. A century and a half of vampirism had changed her, and the decades in the prison world had changed her further. She had formed her own family there, a group of vampire witch hybrids she called her family. These were the heretics, siphoner witches who had been turned into vampires, giving them the ability to siphon their own vampire magic and use it as power. They were abominations by Gemini standards, rejected by the Coven and by vampire society, and Lily had collected them as her children, loved them in ways she'd been unable to love Stefan and Damon during their human lives. The heretics descended on Mystic Falls with Lily's blessing. Valerie, who had loved Stefan during their human lives and had been pregnant with his child before the pregnancy was destroyed by Lily's companion Julian. Malcolm, who was volatile and violent and barely controlled. Nora and Mary Louise, lovers who had been persecuted in their human lives and found acceptance only with Lily. Beau, who was gentle despite his power and communicated through sign language. And Oscar, who collected art and saw beauty in a world most of them viewed as hostile. The revelation of Valerie and Stefan's past rewrote history Stefan thought he understood. He had loved Valerie before Catherine Pierce, had been ready to run away with her, had never known she was pregnant with his child. Julian, Lily's lover, had attacked Valerie and beaten her so badly that she lost the baby, destroyed the one chance Stefan had to be a father, to have a family of his own. Stefan had spent a century and a half never knowing how close he'd come to a different life, to a future that didn't involve Catherine or vampirism or any of the darkness that followed. Julian's return created immediate conflict. He had been a vampire before Lily, had turned her and brought her into vampire society, and their relationship was toxic in ways that Lily couldn't or wouldn't acknowledge. Julian possessed another vampire's body, took it over completely, and began terrorizing Mystic Falls with the casual cruelty of someone who had survived centuries by being more vicious than his enemies. Damon struggled with his mother's return in ways Stefan didn't. Stefan wanted to believe Lily could be redeemed, could reconnect with her human sons, could choose them over the heretics. Damon saw more clearly. Lily had abandoned them, had chosen her new family over her biological children, had proven that blood meant less than she claimed. The pain of that rejection drove Damon into darkness, made him cruel and reckless in ways he hadn't been since his early vampire years. The conflict between the Salvatore brothers and the heretics dominated Mystic Falls for months. The heretics were powerful in ways normal vampires couldn't match, able to use magic and vampire abilities simultaneously, able to siphon the magic from spells and use it against their enemies. They were also unstable, broken by years of persecution and imprisonment, loyal to Lily, but destructive in their loyalty. Stefan killed Julian eventually, ended the threat he represented, but in doing so, he destroyed his relationship with his mother. Lily had loved Julian despite his cruelty, had chosen him over her sons. And Stefan's act of protection felt like betrayal to her. She desiccated herself shortly after, chose to sleep rather than exist in a world without Julian, abandoned her sons a second time in ways that hurt worse than the first abandonment. The Gemini Coven was destroyed utterly. Kai's revenge had been thorough. He killed the leadership, scattered the survivors, broke the traditions that had governed them for centuries. The merge would never happen again. The bloodline was broken, and the powerful witch family that had existed for generations was reduced to scattered refugees hiding from what they'd become. Caroline Forbes discovered she was pregnant despite being a vampire, despite the fact that vampires couldn't create life. The Gemini Coven had transferred their last hope into her. The twins Josie and Lizzie, daughters of Alaric Saltzman and Joe Parker, magically implanted in Caroline's vampire body to save them when their mother died. Caroline carried children that weren't biologically hers, bore them to term through magic and determination, became a mother in the most unexpected way possible. The heretics eventually found peace or destruction, depending on their choices. Some died violently, unable to escape the patterns of violence they'd learned in the prison world. Others found redemption, discovered that being an abomination didn't mean being a monster, that they could choose who they became despite what they were. Valerie left Mystic Falls carrying the knowledge that she and Stefan could never be what they'd once been, that too much time and pain separated them from the love they'd shared in 1863. The legacy of the Gemini Coven lived on in Josie and Lizzie, twin witches who would never have to merge, who would grow up in a world where being different didn't mean being an abomination. They represented hope that bloodline curses could be broken, that the sins of the parents didn't have to define the children, that family could be chosen rather than inherited. And Stefan and Damon Salvatore faced the truth about their mother, that she had never been the saint they remembered, that she had chosen vampirism over returning to them, that her love had limits they'd been unwilling to acknowledge. The fantasy of the perfect mother who had been stolen from them died with Lily's final desiccation, and they were left with the complicated reality that families were imperfect, that love didn't always mean sacrifice, that sometimes the people who were supposed to protect you chose to save themselves instead. The Armory existed as a secret organization that had operated in shadows for over a century, collecting supernatural artifacts, imprisoning dangerous creatures, and maintaining records of the paranormal that dated back to before America's founding. The building itself stood in Virginia, appearing to outsiders as nothing more than a historical society dedicated to preserving regional heritage. But beneath the polite facade lay vaults containing objects of terrible power, cells designed to hold beings that couldn't be killed, and an archive documenting supernatural events that official history had erased or explained away. The Armory's leadership consisted of families who had dedicated generations to this work, who understood that the supernatural world existed parallel to the mundane, who believed that knowledge and containment were the only defenses humanity possessed against creatures that could kill with casual ease. They cataloged every vampire sighting, every werewolf attack, every witch's spell, building a comprehensive understanding of the supernatural landscape that rivaled even the oldest vampire's knowledge. Deep beneath the Armory, sealed behind layers of magic and steel, something ancient had been imprisoned. A vault that even the armory's leadership feared to open, that had been sealed by witches generations ago with spells designed to last forever. The warnings carved into the vault's entrance were clear. Whatever lived inside was worse than death, more dangerous than any creature the armory had catalogued, and releasing it would bring catastrophe to the world above. The vault had remained sealed for over a century, its contents unknown, its danger theoretical until someone was foolish or desperate enough to open it. Bonnie Bennett triggered the vault's opening accidentally while searching the armory for information about the sleeping spell binding Elena. She had been desperate, willing to take risks she normally wouldn't consider, believing that somewhere in the armory's vast collection there must be knowledge that could help her break the spell without killing herself in the process. She found the vault, found references to a spell that might work, and in her rush to access the information, she triggered the mechanisms that had kept the vault sealed for generations. The door swung wide, and what emerged wasn't a single creature, but rather a presence, an infection that spread through touch and sound and proximity. The armory staff fell first, their minds corrupted by what they'd been exposed to, their humanity stripped away as they became extensions of whatever force had been imprisoned in the vault. They attacked each other with savage efficiency, transformed from scholars and researchers into predators within minutes of exposure. The sirens had been released. Not the mythological creatures of Greek legend, but something older and more terrible that had taken those names because humans needed to call them something. Sybil and Selene, psychic vampires who fed not on blood, but on the darkness in human souls, who consumed evil and suffering and used it to sustain themselves and feed their master. Sybil was beautiful in an unsettling way, with dark hair and eyes that seemed to see through flesh into the thoughts beneath. She moved with predatory grace that made normal vampires look clumsy by comparison, spoke with honeyed words that made people want to trust her, to confess their darkest secrets, to hand over their souls willingly. She had been alive for thousands of years, had served her master since before recorded history began, and she was very, very good at her work. Her psychic abilities allowed her to enter minds and rewrite memories, to make people believe things that had never happened, to erase entire relationships and replace them with fabrications. Her master was Cade, though the world knew him by other names. The devil, Satan, Hades, the ruler of hell. But Cade had been human once, millennia ago, the first psychic to ever exist. He had been born with abilities that let him read minds and see souls, and what he'd seen in human consciousness had destroyed him. He'd witnessed every dark thought, every murderous impulse, every evil intention hiding beneath civilized facades, and he'd been unable to block it out, unable to find peace from the constant bombardment of human malevolence. The villagers who had raised him grew to fear his power, to see him as demonic rather than gifted. They'd burned him alive, tied him to a stake, and set him aflame while he screamed and begged and cursed them with his dying breath. As he died, Cade's psychic abilities had created a dimension of fire and suffering, a hell built from his pain and rage and the concentrated evil he'd witnessed in human minds. He'd become the ruler of his own damnation, and for thousands of years he'd collected evil souls, pulled them into his hell dimension, fed on their suffering the way sirens fed on darkness. Sybil and Celine served Cade by finding him souls. They would identify the worst humans: murderers, rapists, war criminals, people whose capacity for evil marked them as suitable for Cade's hell, and they would mark those souls for collection when death came. But finding enough truly evil humans was time-consuming, and Cade was always hungry, always demanding more souls, always pushing his servants to deliver greater quantities of darkness for him to consume. So the sirens found a more efficient method. They would corrupt good people, would twist them into monsters, would turn saints into sinners so their souls would be dark enough for Cade to consume when death finally came for them. Damon Salvatore became Sybil's primary project. She captured him, used her psychic abilities to enter his mind, and began systematically destroying his memories of Elena Gilbert. Every moment they'd shared, every declaration of love, every sacrifice made, every gentle touch and whispered promise, Sybil took them and replaced them with herself. She rewrote Damon's history so completely that he believed he'd loved Sybil for decades, that Elna had been an obstacle, keeping them apart, that serving Cade was what he'd always wanted to do. The compulsion was so deep that Damon couldn't recognize it, couldn't fight back against the rewriting of his entire emotional landscape. Stefan fell under Sybil's influence as well, though his corruption took a different form. She forced him to turn off his humanity switch, to become the Ripper again, to kill on Cade's behalf and deliver souls to hell. Stefan and Damon became Cade's servants, brothers working together in darkness, killing sinners to feed the devil, while believing they were doing righteous work, convinced that they were eliminating evil from the world rather than serving it. The distinction mattered to Cade. He didn't want innocent souls. Those would poison his hell, would disrupt the careful balance of suffering he'd cultivated over millennia. He wanted evil, wanted darkness, wanted souls so stained by sin that their torment would sustain him rather than weaken him. So he sent Stefan and Damon to kill murderers and criminals, people whose deaths might even be considered justice, people the world wouldn't miss. And he consumed the evil in their souls when they died, pulled them into his hell dimension, added their suffering to the thousands of others already trapped in eternal torment. Bonnie Bennett received a huntress curse that complicated everything further. She became the supernatural vampire hunter, marked with a symbol that grew across her body with each vampire she was exposed to. The curse had belonged to Reyna Cruz, a legendary vampire hunter who had been killing vampires for decades, whose sword was mystically connected to her victims and would always find them no matter how far they ran. When Bonnie inherited the curse through magical transfer, she inherited the compulsion to hunt, the inability to resist killing vampires, and worst of all, the certainty that if she gave in to the curse fully, Enzo, the person she loved most, would die because the magic would take the one she cared for most as payment for her power. Enzo St. John had been a minor figure in Mystic Fall's supernatural landscape, a vampire with his own tragic history who had grown close to Bonnie during the years when everyone else was focused on other crises. Their relationship had developed slowly, built on mutual respect and understanding, on the recognition that both of them had been used and discarded by people who claimed to love them. Enzo saw Bonnie as more than the powerful witch everyone relied on for solutions. Bonnie saw Enzo as more than the vampire with anger issues and abandonment trauma. Together, they'd found something real in a world of supernatural manipulation and constant betrayal. But the huntress curse threatened everything. Bonnie could feel the compulsion growing stronger with each passing day, the need to hunt and kill vampires becoming harder to resist. And the magic specifically targeted the person she loved most, which meant Enzo was in constant danger from the curse she carried. They tried to find ways around it, tried to break the curse or transfer it to someone else. But huntress magic was ancient and specifically designed to be unbreakable, to persist until the hunter died or gave in completely. Celine revealed herself as Sybil's sister, another siren, though her methods were different and her philosophy more complex. Where Sybil was overtly predatory, Celine had spent years disguised as a nanny and caretaker, positioning herself close to families, to children. To innocents, she could corrupt gradually, rather than violently. She had been working with the twins Josie and Lizzie, teaching them magic while secretly marking them as future servants of Cade. Celine believed she was being merciful, believed that serving Cade was better than the alternatives, believed that hell under Cade's control was necessary to maintain cosmic balance between good and evil. The truth about Sybil and Celine's origins emerged in fragments as the Salvatore brothers fought against their control. The sirens had been human once, village girls in ancient times, gifted with psychic abilities that made them outcasts in their community. They'd been sentenced to death by villagers who feared their power, thrown from a cliff as punishment for witchcraft they hadn't actually practiced. But as they fell toward the rocks below, they'd called out to anyone who might save them, and Cade had answered from his hell dimension. He'd made them immortal, made them sirens, given them power and eternal life in exchange for eternal servitude. They'd served him for millennia, had delivered countless souls to his hell, had become extensions of his will rather than independent beings. But Celine had grown tired of serving over the course of thousands of years. She saw the twins as potential replacements, believed that if she could deliver two psychics powerful enough to replace her and Sybil, Cade might release them from their service. It was manipulation wrapped in the appearance of mercy, a plan that would save herself at the cost of condemning children to the same eternal servitude she wanted to escape. She convinced herself it was necessary, that the twins would eventually thank her for giving them purpose and power, that serving Cade was actually a privilege rather than a curse. The confrontation with Cade himself came when the Salvatore brothers finally broke free of his control through a combination of Bonnie's magic, Caroline's determination, and the twins' combined power. Caroline Forbes used Josie and Lizzie's magic to create a pathway to Cade's hell dimension, to face the devil in his own domain and demand the return of Stefan and Damon's souls. What they found was a man, not a monster. A man who had been so damaged by human evil that he'd become evil himself, who ruled a dimension built from his own trauma and rage, and the concentrated darkness he'd absorbed from thousands of years of human consciousness. Cade's hell was fire and psychological torture combined, a place where the damned relived their worst moments eternally, where guilt and fear became physical sensations, where suffering was the only constant in an existence without end. Souls burned not from flames, but from the weight of their own sins, from forced confrontation with every terrible thing they'd done during life. They experienced their victims' pain, felt what they'd inflicted on others, understood completely what they'd destroyed. Cade walked through this hell untouched, fed on the suffering like food, grew stronger from each tortured soul screaming in his dimension. Stefan found his humanity again through Elena's intervention, through memories that Sybil had tried to erase but couldn't fully destroy, because love left marks too deep for even psychic manipulation to reach. The love he'd felt for Elena wasn't gone, just buried beneath layers of compulsion and false memories. And recovering it meant recovering everything else. The guilt over his Ripper kills, the pain of losing so many people, the knowledge of what he'd done while serving Cade. The weight of those memories nearly destroyed him, sent him spiraling into self-loathing that made him believe he didn't deserve redemption or forgiveness or any kind of peace. Damon's recovery was more complicated and more painful. Sybil had rewritten years of memories, had made him believe he'd never truly loved Elena, had convinced him that his service to Cade was righteous rather than evil. Breaking through that compulsion required help from multiple sources. Bonnie's magic channeled through the twins, Stefan's unwavering determination to save his brother, and eventually Elena herself, whose presence in Damon's mind was strong enough that even Sybil couldn't completely erase it. The moment Damon remembered Elena truly, remembered what they'd meant to each other, the false memories shattered like glass, and he was left picking up pieces of himself. The sleeping spell keeping Elena in her magical coma became a source of constant pain for Damon once his memories returned. He could see her, could sit beside her sleeping form in the room where she was preserved, but he couldn't wake her without killing Bonnie. The choice was impossible. The woman he loved, or his best friend. The future he wanted, or the person who had saved him repeatedly. Damon considered desiccating himself, joining Elena in suspension until Bonnie died naturally decades in the future. But Stefan wouldn't allow it, wouldn't let his brother choose oblivion, insisted there had to be another way, even when all evidence suggested otherwise. Bonnie's life was literally being siphoned away by the spell maintaining Elena's preservation. She aged normally while Elena remained frozen, but the magic was slowly killing her, draining her life force to maintain Elena's suspended animation. She had perhaps 60 years if she was lucky. Less if the spell's drain accelerated as her power depleted. And every day she lived was another day Elena missed. Another day Damon suffered. Another day the impossible choice loomed over everyone who loved either of them. The sirens were eventually destroyed, though the cost was high and the battle brutal. Celine found redemption at the last moment, chose to sacrifice herself to help defeat her sister and free herself from Cade's service after millennia of slavery. She walked into Cade's hell dimension willingly, knowing it would destroy her, believing that even damnation was preferable to continuing as his servant. Sybil fought until the end, believing that serving Cade was the only purpose her existence held, that without him she was nothing, that thousands of years of servitude had erased whatever person she'd been before becoming a siren. Their deaths broke part of Cade's power, eliminated his most effective servants, gave the Mystic Falls group a fighting chance against a being who had seemed invincible. But Cade himself remained, and his hell remained, and the souls he'd collected over millennia continued to suffer in his dimension. The conflict with the devil wasn't over. It was only beginning to escalate. Because Cade had decided that if he couldn't have Stefan and Damon as his servants, he would have them as his victims. He would pull them into hell when they died, would torment them eternally for defying him, would make examples of them to warn others against resistance. He promised them that death would not bring peace, but rather an eternity of suffering specifically designed for their individual psychological weaknesses. The deal that had been struck years earlier, Elena's life for Bonnie's, Damon's future for Elena's present, continued to shape every choice made in Mystic Falls. It was a bargain born of desperation, maintained by love, and ultimately unsustainable. Something would have to break eventually. Someone would have to sacrifice. The question was who would make that choice, and whether they could live with the consequences of watching someone they loved suffer. The devil walked among them now, no longer a distant threat, but an immediate presence. Hell wasn't some theoretical afterlife, but a real dimension accessible from the living world through magic and psychic power. And the people of Mystic Falls, who had survived vampires and werewolves and witches and hybrids and doppelgangers and every other supernatural threat imaginable, now faced something even ancient vampires feared. They faced damnation itself, personified in a being who had been feeding on human evil since the dawn of civilization, who had perfected torture over thousands of years, who couldn't be killed by any conventional means because he existed partially outside reality in a dimension of his own creation. The sleeping curse that bound Elena Gilbert had become the defining tragedy of Damon Salvatore's existence. She lay in the Salvatore boarding house, preserved in perfect suspended animation, her body unchanging, while the world continued around her. The spell was unbreakable, linked to Bonnie Bennett's life force in ways that made any attempt to wake Elena prematurely an act of murder. As long as Bonnie lived, Elena would sleep. When Bonnie died her natural death 60 or 70 years in the future, Elena would wake unchanged, ready to live her life as if no time had passed. Damon visited Elena every day, sat beside her sleeping form, spoke to her about everything happening in Mystic Falls, even though she couldn't hear him. He told her about the battles they'd fought, about the people they'd lost, about how much he missed her voice and her laugh, and the way she'd look at him like he was capable of being good, despite all evidence to the contrary. The one-sided conversations were torture, but they were also the only thing keeping Damon connected to hope, to the future, to the belief that someday they would be together again. Stefan watched his brother suffer and felt helpless to ease that pain. He understood what Damon was going through, understood the specific agony of loving someone you couldn't reach, of watching them exist just beyond your grasp. Stefan had lost Elena too, had accepted that she'd chosen Damon, had made his peace with that choice. But seeing Damon destroyed by Elena's absence, seeing his brother slowly breaking under the weight of decades of separation, made Stefan wish there was something, anything he could do to help. The cure to vampirism resurfaced as a potential solution to multiple problems. It existed as a single dose, the same cure that had been created 2,000 years ago by Ketsia, the cure that Catherine had taken and that had aged her rapidly to compensate for 500 years of vampirism. The cure could make a vampire human again, could restore mortality, could allow whoever took it to live and age and eventually die as humans were meant to. And most importantly for Damon's situation, It would allow him to grow old alongside Elena when she finally woke, would give them a human life together instead of him remaining eternally young while she aged and died. But taking the cure meant giving up immortality, giving up the power and strength and healing that came with being a vampire. It meant accepting vulnerability, accepting death, accepting that someday the person who took it would cease to exist entirely. For vampires who had lived centuries, who had grown accustomed to their supernatural abilities, who had built their identities around being predators, the cure represented both salvation and annihilation. Stefan made the decision that would define his final acts. He chose to take the cure, to become human again after a century and 65 years of vampirism. He did it partially for Caroline Forbes, the woman he'd come to love, who had spoken wistfully about the human experiences she'd lost when she was turned. Marriage, children, growing old with someone she loved, all impossible as a vampire, all potentially restored if Stefan was human. But he also did it for himself, as a way to finally break the cycle of guilt and violence that had defined his vampire existence, as a way to experience mortality before it was too late. The cure worked instantly. Stefan injected it into his bloodstream and felt his vampire nature stripped away in seconds. His enhanced strength vanished, his healing abilities disappeared, his heightened senses dulled to human levels. For the first time in over a century and a half, Stefan Salvatore had a heartbeat. He could feel it pounding in his chest, could feel warmth returning to his skin, could feel hunger and thirst and exhaustion in ways he'd forgotten were possible. He was human, mortal, vulnerable in ways that terrified and exhilarated him in equal measure. Caroline and Stefan's wedding was planned as a celebration of new beginnings, a moment of joy in a world that had provided too little of it recently. Caroline threw herself into the preparations with characteristic enthusiasm, determined to create something beautiful and meaningful despite all the darkness they'd endured. She chose a venue, selected flowers, designed every detail with the perfectionism that had defined her since her human days. This wedding would be perfect, would be the fairy tale she'd dreamed about as a girl, would prove that even in a world of vampires and curses and supernatural tragedy, love could still triumph. The ceremony took place on a spring evening, with the people they'd fought beside serving as witnesses. Bonnie stood as Caroline's maid of honor, wearing a dress that hid how much the sleeping spell was draining her, smiling through the exhaustion that had become her constant companion. Damon served as Stefan's best man, putting aside his own pain long enough to support his brother on the happiest day of Stefan's life. The Mystic Falls group gathered together, supernatural and human, vampire and witch and werewolf, united by the bonds they'd forged through years of surviving impossible threats. Stefan and Caroline exchanged vows that acknowledged everything they'd been through, all the darkness they'd survived, all the people they'd lost along the way. They promised to build something better together, to create a life defined by hope rather than fear, to give the Gemini twins Josie and Lizzie the stable family they deserved. When Stefan kissed his bride, he did it as a human man marrying a vampire woman, accepting that their love would require navigating complications that normal couples never faced. But happiness in Mystic Falls never lasted long. Catherine Pierce returned with a vengeance that had been building since the moment she'd been forced to become human again. She had spent the intervening time planning, manipulating, positioning pieces on a chessboard only she could see. Catherine had always been a survivor, had always found ways to turn disadvantage into opportunity, and her current mortality had only sharpened her desperation and her cunning. Catherine had made a deal with Cade, the devil himself, trading information and souls in exchange for power she shouldn't have possessed as a human. She'd told Cade about the Salvatore brothers, about their weaknesses and their loves, about exactly how to hurt them most effectively. And in exchange, Cade had given Catherine the ability to possess Elena Gilbert's sleeping body, to wear Elena's face, to pretend to be the woman Damon loved while actually being the woman who had destroyed the Salvatore brothers centuries ago. The possession was perfect, undetectable, even to those closest to Elena. Catherine had access to all of Elena's memories through the shared doppelganger connection, could mimic her mannerisms and speech patterns flawlessly, could fool everyone into believing Elena had somehow woken early from her enchanted sleep. She appeared at Stefan and Caroline's wedding reception, tearful and disoriented, claiming she didn't understand how she'd woken, but grateful to be back among the people she loved. Damon's joy at seeing Elena awake was absolute and terrible to witness. He pulled her into his arms, kissed her with desperate relief, clung to her like she might disappear if he let go. And Catherine, wearing Elena's face, kissed him back and smiled, and began executing the final phase of her revenge. She had spent 500 years being hunted and hated and blamed for everything the Salvatore brothers had become. Now she would make them pay for every moment of suffering, would destroy everything they'd built, would ensure that at least one Salvatore brother spent eternity in hell with her when this was all over. The revelation came too late to prevent catastrophe. Stefan discovered the truth about Catherine's possession, realized that Elena was still asleep beneath Catherine's control, that everything Damon had experienced with Elena had been a lie. But Catherine had already set her final plan in motion, had already ensured that no matter what happened next, the Salvatore brothers would suffer. Cade was destroyed through a combination of magic and sacrifice, his hell dimension destabilized by the twins' power channeled through Bonnie's desperate spell. But Catherine claimed hell for herself in the power vacuum that followed, became its new ruler, took control of the dimension Cade had created, and bent it to her own purposes. She promised that hell would claim a Salvatore brother when all this was over, that Stefan or Damon would spend eternity being tortured in the dimension she now controlled, that their suffering would be her eternal satisfaction. Hell began to collapse without Cade's power maintaining its structure. The dimension was destabilizing, bleeding into the living world, threatening to consume Mystic Falls entirely. The portal between worlds was expanding, pulling everything nearby into its fiery embrace, and if it wasn't closed immediately, the entire town would be dragged into Catherine's hell dimension. Hundreds of innocent people would die, would be trapped in eternal torment through no fault of their own, would suffer because of supernatural conflicts they didn't even know existed. Someone had to close the hell portal from inside. Someone had to stay behind in hell to ensure it sealed properly, to ensure Catherine couldn't reopen it, to ensure the living world remained safe from the dimension of torment threatening to engulf it. It was a suicide mission, a one-way journey, a sacrifice that meant eternal damnation for whoever made the choice. Stefan made that choice. He was human now, mortal, which meant he could die in ways that would actually stick instead of healing and continuing. And he'd taken the cure specifically so he could give it to Damon, could allow his brother to grow old with Elena, could provide the happy ending Damon had been denied for so long. Stefan had lived 165 years as a vampire, had committed sins he could never fully atone for, and he saw this as his final redemption, his last chance to be the hero he'd always wanted to be. He said goodbye to Caroline in moments stolen while the world was ending around them. Told her he loved her, that she'd given him hope when he'd thought himself beyond saving, that the brief time they'd had as husband and wife had been worth everything. Caroline tried to stop him, tried to find another way, tried to argue that they deserved more time together, that they'd barely started their life. But Stefan was resolute, had made his choice, and nothing she said would change his mind. He said goodbye to Damon in the ruins of their childhood home, in the boarding house where they'd lived and fought and reconciled countless times. Compelled Damon to leave, to save himself, used the last of his human strength to force his brother to run, while Stefan stayed behind to face Catherine and close the portal. He told Damon he loved him, that being brothers had been the one constant in 1.5 centuries of chaos, that Damon had to live and be happy and give their family line the peace it had been denied since 1864. Stefan confronted Catherine in hell itself, in the dimension she now ruled. She gloated about her victory, about how she'd destroyed everything the Salvatore brothers had built, about how she'd finally gotten her revenge after 5 centuries of running. But Stefan didn't care about her satisfaction or her revenge. He cared about saving his brother, about giving Damon the future Stefan himself would never have, about ensuring that at least one of them escaped the curse that had defined their existence since the night they'd both died and woken as monsters. He used his mortality as a weapon, grabbed Catherine and held her close, pulled her into himself, absorbed her spirit into his dying human body. Because humans could be possessed, could serve as vessels for supernatural entities, and Stefan used that vulnerability deliberately. He trapped Catherine inside himself, prevented her from escaping or continuing to rule hell, and then he destroyed the portal's anchor with his death, sealing hell permanently and ensuring Catherine would be trapped there with him for eternity. Stefan Salvatore died saving his brother and the town he'd once called home, died as a human, as he'd been born 171 years earlier, as he'd always wanted to die before Catherine Pierce had stolen his mortality and damned him to immortality. His last thoughts were of Caroline, of Damon, of the peace he hoped he'd find after a 1.5 lifetimes of guilt and violence and desperate attempts at redemption. But death for Stefan wasn't the hell Catherine had promised. It was peace. Real peace. The kind he'd been denied since the moment he'd woken in transition in 1864. He found himself in a dimension that wasn't hell, but rather something like heaven. A place where the supernatural could rest after their struggles ended. And waiting for him there was Lexi, his best friend who had died years ago, who welcomed him home with the joy of someone who had been waiting decades for this reunion. Damon survived, forced to live with his brother's sacrifice, forced to carry the weight of Stefan's final gift. He took the cure that Stefan had prepared for him, became human, and chose to wait for Elena with mortal patience rather than immortal desperation. He had 60 years or more to fill before Bonnie's natural death would wake Elena, and he decided to use that time to earn the peace Stefan had died to give him. He became the person Stefan had always believed he could be. Helped people, protected Mystic Falls from the supernatural threats that continued to emerge, built a life defined by more than his own pain and desire. He thought about Stefan every day, missed his brother with an intensity that never quite faded, but he also honored Stefan's sacrifice by actually living rather than merely existing. Caroline Forbes founded a school for supernatural children in the Salvatore brothers' names, a place where young vampires and witches and werewolves could learn to control their abilities, could find community and acceptance, could grow up knowing they weren't monsters, but rather people with unique challenges. The Salvatore school became a legacy, a way of ensuring that the brothers' suffering produced something beautiful, that future generations wouldn't have to navigate the supernatural world as blindly as Stefan and Damon had. Josie and Lizzie Saltzman grew up in that school, learned magic in an environment that celebrated rather than feared their abilities, never had to face the merge that had defined previous Gemini twins. They represented the breaking of generational curses, the possibility that children didn't have to repeat their parents' traumas, that love and support could change destiny. Bonnie Bennett lived a full human life, traveled the world, found joy in the years she'd been certain would be cut short. The sleeping spell drained her gradually rather than catastrophically, and she made peace with the sacrifice she'd made for her best friend. When death finally came for her in her late 80s, she went willingly, grateful for the life she'd lived, ready to reunite with Enzo on whatever other side remained after so much had been destroyed and rebuilt. And Elena Gilbert woke unchanged, exactly as she'd been the day she'd been spelled to sleep. She woke to a world that had moved forward 60 years without her, to the news that Stefan was dead and Damon was an old man waiting patiently for her return. She woke to grief and loss and the cruel reality that choosing to love vampires meant watching everyone you knew fade while you remained frozen. But she also woke to Damon, still there after all those decades, still loving her with the same intensity despite the years and the gray in his hair and the lines on his face. They had whatever time remained to him, perhaps 10 or 20 years if they were lucky, and they chose to live those years fully. They married, built a home, experienced all the ordinary human moments they'd been denied during the years of supernatural chaos. Elena became a doctor, fulfilled the dream she'd had since before vampires entered her life, spent her remaining years healing people and saving lives and giving back to the world that had taken so much from her. Damon supported her, loved her, finally experienced the peace he'd been chasing since 1864 when Catherine Pierce had destroyed his humanity. And when death came for Damon Salvatore, decades after his brother's sacrifice, he went without fear, because he knew Stefan was waiting, knew that peace was possible after the long struggle, knew that the love he'd fought for across a century and a half had been worth every moment of suffering. In whatever dimension served as the afterlife for the supernatural, Stefan and Damon were reunited, brothers again, freed from the curse of vampirism, released from the guilt and violence that had defined their immortal years. They found peace together, found their parents and the people they'd loved and lost, found that death wasn't an ending, but rather a beginning of something better. Mystic Falls remained, generation after generation, forever marked by the supernatural, even as it appeared to outsiders like any other small Virginia town. The Salvatore School continued its work, Caroline Forbes immortal and committed to honoring her husband's sacrifice. And the story of two brothers who had loved the same woman, who had been destroyed and redeemed, and finally found peace, became legend whispered among supernatural creatures as a reminder that redemption was possible, that love could survive even death, that the longest night eventually gave way to dawn. And so, the story that began with death and transformation ends with life reclaimed. Elena woke after decades of magical sleep, reunited with Damon, who had waited patiently, who had become the man his brother always believed he could be. They lived their human years fully, married, loved, experienced the ordinary moments that felt extraordinary after so much supernatural chaos. Elena became a doctor, healing the world that had wounded her so deeply. Damon found peace in simple domesticity, in growing old beside the woman he'd loved across lifetimes. When death came for them, it came gently, and they found Stefan waiting on the other side, reunited with Lexi and all the souls they'd lost along the way. The Salvatore brothers together again, finally free from the curse that began in 1864. Caroline's school continued, generation after generation of supernatural children learning they weren't monsters, but miracles. Mystic Falls remained forever changed, forever aware that magic walks among us, that love transcends even death, that redemption is possible for those brave enough to seek it. Close your eyes now, dear traveler. Drift into dreams where small towns hold infinite secrets, where love is worth fighting for across centuries, and where peace awaits even the longest night. Sleep well, sleep deep, until dawn comes again. Good night.